There is a photograph that has haunted researchers, journalists, and survivors for decades. It shows a group of children standing on a dock. They are wearing their best clothes. Some of them are holding small bags. Some of them are squinting into the sun. They look like children going on an adventure. They look like children who have been told something exciting is about to happen. They are somewhere between 7 and 14 years old. Behind them, a large ship rises out of the water. And the thing you have to understand when you look at this photograph, the thing that takes a moment to fully land in your chest, is that most of these children had parents. Living, breathing, present parents who were in Britain at that very moment. Some of those parents had been told their children were dead. Some had been told their children had emigrated voluntarily. Some had never been told anything at all. They had simply gone to collect their child from a charity home, or a hospital, or a welfare institution, and been informed, with very little explanation, that the child was no longer there. The children in that photograph were being shipped to the other side of the world. Some were going to Australia, some were going to Canada, some were going to what was then Rhodesia, some were going to New Zealand. They were not going as the children of emigrating families. They were not going as part of any kind of family unit. They were going alone, as children, on the official understanding that they had no one, that they were unwanted, that they were the surplus of Britain's poverty and social failure, and that a new life in a colony with clean air and hard work and open skies would be better for them than anything Britain could offer. Almost none of that was true, and the people running the programs knew it. What you are about to hear is the story of the British child migration schemes. It is the story of approximately 150,000 children, most of them poor, most of them already vulnerable, who were taken from Britain and transported to distant countries over the course of roughly a century, beginning in the 1860s and continuing, astonishingly, until 1970. 1970. This is not a Victorian story, though it has Victorian roots. This is a story that was still happening when the Beatles had already broken up. This is a story that was still happening when colour television was in living rooms across Britain. This is a story that was still happening when some of you watching this were already alive. And for most of that century, almost no one outside the institutions involved knew the full truth of what was being done. If this kind of history is something you want to understand, if you want to hear stories that the official record tried to bury, please subscribe and leave a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from. The people who lived through this deserve to know their story is still being heard. Now, let us begin at the beginning. And the beginning, as with so many things in British social history, begins with the question of what a society does with its poor. Britain, in the middle of the 19th century, was a country of extraordinary contradictions. It was, by almost every measure, the wealthiest and most powerful nation on earth. Its empire stretched across a quarter of the globe. Its factories were producing goods that were being sold in every market from Buenos Aires to Bombay. Its navy was unmatched. Its cities were growing at a pace that no previous civilization had experienced. London, in 1850, was the largest city in the world, and inside that city, inside all the cities, inside the mill towns and the mining communities and the port neighborhoods, there was poverty of a kind that is genuinely difficult to describe. Not the relative poverty of modern reckoning, absolute poverty. Children dying of malnutrition in rooms with no heat. Families of 8 or 10 people sharing a single room. Children working 12 and 14-hour days in factories and mines. Children sleeping under bridges. Children who had never owned a pair of shoes. The Victorian response to this poverty was complicated and, in many respects, deeply contradictory. On one hand, there was genuine philanthropic impulse. Real people who genuinely cared and who dedicated real time and money to the question of how to improve the lives of poor children. On the other hand, there was a pervasive, ideological belief, shared across class lines and political affiliations, that poverty was at least partly a moral failing, that the poor were in some sense responsible for their condition, and that the children of the poor were in constant danger of inheriting not just their parents' economic circumstances, but their parents' moral character. This ideology had a name. It was called moral contagion, and it shaped British social policy for the better part of a century. The idea was this: if a child grew up surrounded by poverty, surrounded by what the Victorians called the dangerous classes, that child would be contaminated by the environment. The child would learn dishonesty, laziness, vice, immorality. The child would grow up to reproduce the same poverty, the same social failure in the next generation. The only way to break the cycle was to remove the child from the environment entirely, to take them out of the slum, out of the city, away from the influence of their poverty-stricken parents and neighbours, and place them somewhere clean, somewhere rural, somewhere they could develop what the Victorians called moral fibre. This is the ideological foundation of the child migration schemes. It did not come from malice. Some of it came from genuine, if profoundly misguided, care. But the effect of it, played out across 100 years and 150,000 children, was catastrophic. The man who is most closely associated with the origin of the systematic child migration programs is a Canadian called Andrew Doyle. But the woman who did more than anyone else to actually build the machinery of child export was a remarkable, complicated, and ultimately deeply troubling figure named Annie Macpherson. Annie Macpherson was born in Scotland in 1833. She was a devout Christian, a Quaker-influenced philanthropist, who in the 1860s began working in the East End of London among the population of destitute children she found there. What she found in the East End genuinely horrified her. Children who had been abandoned, children whose parents were in workhouses, children working in match factories and suffering from the phosphorus poisoning that caused their jaws to rot, children sleeping in doorways, children who were visibly, measurably dying of poverty. Macpherson's response was to open what she called Home of Industry, a refuge where children could be fed, housed, and given basic education. She was tireless. She was genuinely devoted to the children in her care. And she began, fairly quickly, to believe that Britain itself was the problem, that the environment of industrial Britain, the crowded slums, the factories, the moral atmosphere of poverty, was something that could not be reformed from within. The only solution, she came to believe, was to take these children out of Britain altogether. Canada was the destination she chose. Canada in the 1860s and 1870s was a young country that needed labour. Farm families in Ontario and Quebec and the maritime provinces wanted cheap workers. They were willing to house and feed a child in exchange for farm labour, and the British government, then as now, was interested in populating its dominions with British stock, British children who would grow up to be British citizens of empire, loyal to the Crown and productive members of colonial society. In 1869, Annie Macpherson sent the first group of 100 children to Canada. She called them her home children. She believed, and she told the children, and she told their parents where parents existed, that they were going to good homes, that they would be treated as members of the families they were placed with, that they would receive education and care and opportunity, that Canada was a land of possibility where a poor child from the East End could remake themselves entirely. For some children, this was roughly true. There are genuine success stories among the home children, people who were placed with decent, kind families, who were educated, who thrived, who built good lives. Their descendants are scattered across Canada today, and many of them know their history and feel complicated but not entirely negative things about it. But for many children, perhaps most children, the reality was something else entirely. They were taken to farms and put to work, not as children, as labourers. They were given the hardest jobs, the earliest mornings, the coldest outbuildings to sleep in. They were not sent to school or were sent so infrequently that the education they received was essentially meaningless. They were not treated as members of the family. They were treated as hired hands, except that they were not paid. They were fed and housed, usually adequately, but they were workers, child workers, on farms in Ontario and Manitoba and Saskatchewan, hundreds of miles from anyone they had ever known, with no way to contact their families back in Britain, with no advocate, with no one checking on their welfare, with no way out. The oversight of these placements was essentially non-existent. Macpherson and the organizations that followed in her wake would place a child, collect a fee from the receiving family, and move on. Follow-up visits were sporadic. Complaints from children were rarely investigated. The children had no standing. They were charity cases, products of poverty, moral risks who had been rescued from contamination. If they were unhappy, if they were being mistreated, the assumption of the system was that they were probably exaggerating, probably ungrateful, probably failing to appreciate what had been done for them. And the parents. What about the parents? This is the element of the child migration story that is most difficult to absorb, even now, even having read everything about it. Because the popular understanding of these programs, for most of the 20th century, was that they involved orphans, children who had no family, children who had been abandoned, who were genuinely unwanted, who had no one to lose by being sent to Canada or Australia. This understanding was, in a very large number of cases, a lie. The organizations running these programs knew that many of the children they were sending abroad had living parents. They knew that some of those parents had not consented to the emigration. They knew that some of those parents had been given false information about where their children were going and what would happen to them. They knew that the signatures on consent forms were sometimes forged or obtained under duress, or obtained from parents who did not understand what they were agreeing to, who believed that they were consenting to a temporary arrangement, a period of care while the family sorted itself out, not a permanent, irreversible removal to the other side of the world. They knew all of this, and they continued anyway, for 100 years. The scale of what Annie Macpherson began was replicated and expanded by dozens of organizations over the following decades. By the time the schemes were at their height, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, somewhere between 50 and 60 organizations were involved in sending British children abroad. Many of them were religious. The Catholic Church had its own program, sending Catholic children to Catholic institutions in Australia. The Church of England had programs. The Salvation Army had programs. Barnardo's, which became the most famous of all the child migration organizations, had a program that eventually sent approximately 30,000 children to Canada alone. Thomas John Barnardo was an Irish-born doctor who came to London in the 1860s to study medicine and stayed because he encountered the poverty of the East End and found he could not look away from it. He was a genuine character, a showman, a publicist, a man who understood that sympathy required narrative, who told compelling stories about individual children to raise the money that kept his homes running. He opened his first ragged school in Stepney in 1867. By the time he died in 1905, he had opened 96 homes across Britain and had personally overseen the care of approximately 60,000 children. Barnardo believed deeply in emigration. He believed it with an evangelical intensity that made him willing to cut corners, to bend rules, to override inconvenient objections in service of what he was convinced was a greater good. He was involved in a series of legal cases in the 1880s and 1890s, brought by parents who claimed he had taken their children without proper consent and refused to return them. In at least one of these cases, the court found against him. Barnardo's response, largely, was to get better at paperwork rather than to fundamentally reconsider his methods. The Barnardo's organization continued child migration to Canada until 1939, when the Second World War made transatlantic shipping impractical. It then transferred much of its migration activity to Australia, where the program continued until 1967. But let us not get ahead of ourselves, because to understand what happened in Australia, you need to understand how the Australian program was different from the Canadian one, different in important ways, and in some respects, worse. The Australian child migration program did not begin in earnest until the 1920s, though there were earlier, smaller efforts. Its growth was driven by two forces that reinforced each other in ways that proved catastrophic for the children caught between them. The first was the same imperial population logic that had driven the Canadian program, amplified by the specific anxieties of the post-war period. The second was the Catholic Church's determination to build and staff Catholic institutions in Australia using British children. After the First World War, Australia faced what its government understood as a demographic crisis. The war had killed approximately 60,000 Australians. The population was small relative to the territory. The birth rate was not keeping pace with what politicians and planners believed the country needed. And the White Australia policy, which was at that point formal government legislation, meant that the solution could not involve immigration from Asia or Africa or anywhere that was not white and preferably British. The Australian government began actively soliciting British children. The Empire Settlement Act of 1922, passed by the British Parliament, provided financial support for schemes that sent British emigrants, including children, to Australia, Canada, and other dominions. State governments in Western Australia in particular were enthusiastic. The Western Australian government established its own child migration scheme and entered into agreements with various British organisations to supply children. The children sent to Australia went primarily to institutions, not to individual families, as was the Canadian model, but to large residential schools and farms run by religious organisations and charities. In Western Australia, the main receiving institution was the Fairbridge Farm School at Pinjarra, founded by a Rhodesian-born idealist named Kingsley Fairbridge, who believed that poor British children could be turned into Australian farmers if they were given the right environment and training. In Victoria and South Australia and New South Wales, Catholic children were sent to institutions run by the Christian Brothers, the Sisters of Mercy, and other religious orders. The children sent to these institutions were, on average, younger than those sent to Canada. Some of them were very young indeed. Some of them were toddlers. There are records of children being sent to Australia at the age of 3 years old, sent alone, without family, to the other side of the world. Placed in an institution, they would not leave until they were old enough to work, many of them never knowing, for decades, whether their parents were alive. Many of them told explicitly and falsely that their parents were dead. This is the detail that the survivors returned to again and again. Not the poverty of the institutions, though poverty was real. Not the inadequate food, though inadequate food was documented. Not the physical punishment, though physical punishment was systematic and sometimes brutal. The detail that survivors return to is the lie about the parents. Children were routinely told that they had no family, that they were orphans, that there was no one back in Britain who wanted them, that they had been sent away because they were unwanted, because they were burdens, because Britain had discarded them. This was told to children who, in many cases, had been taken from parents who were desperately trying to find them. It was told to children whose mothers had signed consent forms they did not fully understand while in hospital after childbirth, or while in the grip of poverty, so severe they believed, or were led to believe, that a temporary separation was their only option. It was told to children whose parents had never consented at all. The psychological effect of this lie on a child's development is not difficult to imagine. To be told, at 7 or 8 or 10 years old, in a foreign country, surrounded by strangers, that you have no family, that no one wants you, that you are alone, is to have something fundamental removed from your sense of self. The children who went through this described, in testimony after testimony, given decades later, the experience of being unmade, of losing not just their family, but their story, their history, their identity. Many of them were given new names at the institutions. Their surnames were sometimes changed. Their birthdays were sometimes changed. Their countries of origin were sometimes changed, so that a child from London or Birmingham or Glasgow became officially, in the records of a Catholic institution in Western Australia, a child from nowhere in particular, a child without history, a child who had simply appeared out of the administrative void. This was not accidental. The erasure of these children's histories was, in at least some cases, deliberate policy. Some of the organizations involved understood that if children retained knowledge of their families, they might try to reconnect with them. They might attract the attention of parents searching for them. They might create legal and administrative complications for the institutions housing them. Better, from the institution's perspective, to remove the history entirely, to start fresh, to create, as one in Fairbridge document put it, children of the empire, rather than children of particular families. The Fairbridge Farm School at Pinjarra is worth examining in some detail because it represents the most optimistic version of the Australian child migration scheme. Kingsley Fairbridge genuinely believed in what he was doing. He was not cynical. He was not running a labour extraction operation. Though the farm school certainly required and benefited from the children's labour, he believed that rural life, physical work, fresh air, and the right moral guidance could transform the children of Britain's urban poor into healthy, capable, productive Australians. His farm school, which received its first children in 1913, was designed as a village. There were cottages, each housing a group of children under the care of a cottage mother. There was a church, there was a schoolroom, there was farmland that the children worked. The intention was that children would live there until they were old enough to enter domestic service or farm work, and then be placed with Australian families in the surrounding district. The reality, particularly after Fairbridge's death in 1924, fell significantly short of the vision. The cottage mothers were often poorly selected, poorly trained, and poorly supervised. Some were kind, some were negligent, some were cruel. The schooling was minimal. The farm work was extensive. The food was monotonous and sometimes inadequate. Children who misbehaved, or who were accused of misbehaving, were punished physically. The isolation of the farm school, 50 miles south of Perth, meant that there was no external oversight of any consequence. Children who arrived at Pinjarra as very young children, who had spent years there, who had been told they had no family, sometimes discovered as teenagers or young adults that this was not true. The discovery could happen in any number of ways. A letter might arrive, forwarded through some bureaucratic accident, from a parent who had been searching for years. A sibling might appear, having tracked down the institution through records held in Britain. Someone who had known the family might pass through the district. In some cases, a child would simply, eventually, as an adult, request their own records and discover the truth buried in the paperwork. The reactions to these discoveries ranged across the entire spectrum of human emotion. Some survivors described relief, the relief of knowing they had not, in fact, been discarded, that there had been someone back in Britain who had wanted them and lost them and never stopped looking. Some described grief for the years lost, for the parents who had died before they could be found, for the siblings who had grown into strangers. Some describe rage at the institutions, at the organizations, at the governments, at the officials who had built and maintained a system predicated on lies told to the most vulnerable people possible, children who had no way to protect themselves, no way to challenge the official version of events, no way to find their own truth. And some describe something that is harder to name, a kind of irreparable damage to the story of themselves. Because when your history has been taken from you at 3 or 5 or 7 years old, when the lie has been the foundation of everything you know about yourself for decades, the discovery of the truth does not simply restore what was lost. You cannot give back a childhood. You cannot restore a relationship that was never allowed to form. You cannot undo 30 or 40 years of believing yourself to be someone who was not wanted, someone who had no origin, someone who came from nothing. The Catholic institutions in particular have been the subject of extensive investigation, testimony, and litigation. The Christian Brothers, who ran a network of institutions across Western Australia, including Bindoon, Castledare, Clontarf, and Tardun, have faced allegations of systematic physical and sexual abuse that are, by any measure, among the most serious in the long history of institutional child abuse in the English-speaking world. The boys sent to these institutions, many of them very young, many of them from deeply impoverished British families, were put to work constructing the buildings they would live in. This is a fact that requires a moment to absorb. Children, some of them as young as 8 or 9, were used as construction labour to build the institutions that housed them. At Bindoon, which sits on about 1,000 acres north of Perth, boys mixed concrete, laid bricks, carried stone. The buildings they built are still standing. They are substantial stone buildings. They are the product of child labour performed by children who were told they were orphans, who had no advocate, who had no knowledge of any right to anything better. The abuse at these institutions, described in hundreds of pages of survivor testimony given to various inquiries, government investigations, and court proceedings, was systematic and long-running. Boys were beaten for minor infractions. Boys were beaten for no infraction at all. And boys were sexually abused by brothers whose positions of authority over isolated, friendless, parentless children gave them access that was essentially unchecked for decades. The response of the Christian Brothers to these allegations, when they began to surface in the 1980s and 1990s, was one of denial, deflection, and institutional self-protection. Individual brothers were moved rather than prosecuted. Victims were discouraged from coming forward. Settlements were reached under confidentiality agreements that prevented victims from speaking publicly. It was not until the 1990s, under sustained pressure from survivors, journalists, and politicians, that the full scale of what had happened began to enter the public record. But we are moving ahead of the story again, because the abuses, devastating as they were not the only, or even the primary, wrong done to these children. The primary wrong was the original displacement, the original decision made by governments and churches and charities in collaboration to take children from their families or from circumstances that were difficult but not irremediable and transport them irreversibly to the other side of the world, stripping them of identity, history, and family in the process. Let us talk about what Britain was like for the poor in the period when these schemes were operating at their height, roughly 1880 to 1939. Because to understand the schemes, you have to understand the world in which the children they targeted were living. The children who were taken were overwhelmingly from the poorest sections of British society. Children in workhouses, children in the care of parish authorities, children whose mothers were in hospital or in prison or in what were then called lunatic asylums, children whose fathers had died or had abandoned the family or were incapacitated by the injuries of industrial labour, children who had been brought to charitable organisations by parents who were temporarily overwhelmed by poverty and who believed, or were led to believe, that this was a temporary measure, that their child would be cared for and returned to them when circumstances improved. The charitable organisations that managed the child migration schemes were not, by and large, operated by people who were indifferent to the children's welfare. Most of them believed genuinely that they were doing good, but their belief system, their ideology, had two elements that together produced catastrophic outcomes. The first was the conviction, already mentioned, that the environment of poverty was morally contaminating and that removal from that environment was beneficial in itself, regardless of the cost in family separation. The second was a deep structural contempt for the parental rights of poor people. Middle-class Victorian and Edwardian Britain did not regard the family bonds of the poor as equivalent to the family bonds of respectable society. The idea that a woman in a workhouse had the same right to her child as a woman in a comfortable house was not widely held. The charitable organizations that ran the migration schemes operated, often quite consciously, on the assumption that they knew better than the poor parents what was good for poor children. That poverty had already demonstrated a kind of parental failure, that the willingness of a parent to place a child temporarily in care was, in itself, evidence that the parent was unfit. This contempt was not always openly expressed, but it structured everything about how the schemes operated. When a parent asked for their child back, the organization had enormous discretionary power to refuse. When a parent claimed not to have consented to emigration, the organization had the records, had the paperwork, had the institutional authority, and the parent had nothing. The courts, such as they were, tended to defer to the institutional expertise of the charities. The charities, in the cases that were challenged, tended to win, and then the child was gone. 5 weeks on a ship to Australia, 6 weeks to Canada, and all the letters in the world, if a parent could even write a letter, could not change that. There is a case that illustrates this with particular clarity, the case of a woman named Charlotte Knowles, which came to light during the investigations of the 1990s. Charlotte Knowles was a widow from Liverpool who in 1924, having fallen into severe poverty after the death of her husband, placed her two sons, aged 8 and 11, in the care of a Catholic charity called the Crusade of Rescue. She was told, she later stated, that the boys would be cared for in an English home while she found work and got back on her feet. She was not told they were being considered for migration. She was not told that the charity was associated with a program that sent children to Australia. She was not asked for consent to any overseas placement. Some months after the boys were placed, Charlotte went to collect them. She was told they had been sent to a home in the country. She was given an address. She wrote to the address. The letters were not answered. She visited the charity's offices and was told, with varying degrees of directness, that the boys' situation was being managed appropriately and that her presence was not helpful to their development. She continued to write. She continued to ask. She filed a complaint with her local council. The council referred her back to the charity. Her sons were at that point in Western Australia, in a Catholic institution outside Perth. They had been there for nearly a year. They had been told their mother had died. Charlotte Knowles spent the rest of her life looking for her sons. She died in 1951 without finding them. Her sons did not discover the truth about their mother until the 1980s, when they were elderly men, prompted by the beginning of the public investigations into child migration. By that time, their mother had been dead for 30 years. Charlotte Knowles is not an exceptional case. Her story is, in its broad outlines, one of hundreds, possibly thousands, that have emerged from the archives and the testimony of survivors. The details change, the organizations change, the destinations change, but the pattern is consistent. A poor, vulnerable parent, trusting an institution with authority and resources, a child taken under circumstances that were misrepresented or not fully explained, an irreversible separation, a lifetime of searching, a discovery, usually too late, of what had actually happened. The organizations that ran the schemes knew about cases like Charlotte Knowles. They knew they were happening because they were made aware of them through letters, through complaints, through occasional legal challenges. Their institutional response to this knowledge was to improve their paperwork procedures, to make sure their consent forms were more thorough, to ensure that their legal basis for the emigration decisions was harder to challenge. It was not to stop. It was not to reconsider the fundamental premise that poor parents' relationships with their children could be subordinated to institutional judgment and imperial demographics. In Canada, the Home Children Program ran from 1869 to 1939, when the war ended it. In that 70-year period, approximately 100,000 children were sent to Canada from Britain. The majority went to Ontario. Significant numbers went to Quebec, Manitoba, and the Maritime Provinces. They were placed primarily in agricultural settings, as farm labourers and domestic servants. The organisations involved included Barnardo's, the Quarrier Homes in Scotland, the Catholic Emigration Association, the Church of England, Waifs and Strays Society, the Salvation Army, and many others. The Canadian government's attitude to the Home Children Program was, across most of its history, one of official approval combined with occasional concern about standards. There were Canadian voices, from quite early on, who raised questions about the program. The Toronto journalist and social reformer John Joseph Kelso argued in the 1890s that the placement system was inadequate, that children were being used as cheap farm labour without proper oversight, that the follow-up was non-existent, and that the welfare of individual children was being sacrificed to the interests of farmers who wanted inexpensive workers and organisations that received fees for each child placed. Andrew Doyle, a British government inspector who toured the Canadian placements in 1875, produced a report that was deeply critical of what he found. He described the children working in conditions of near servitude. He described inadequate schooling. He described physical punishment that exceeded any reasonable standard. He described children who had no knowledge of how to contact their families in Britain, who had no mechanism for raising complaints, who were entirely at the mercy of the families with whom they had been placed. Doyle's report recommended significant reforms to the oversight system. The charities, led by Barnardo's, largely dismissed Doyle's report as exaggerated and politically motivated. The Canadian government took some limited steps to improve oversight, but did not fundamentally change the program. And the shipments continued. The children who arrived in Canada were, in many cases, met by what was called the immigration agent, a local official who was theoretically responsible for ensuring that placements were appropriate. In practice, the agents were overwhelmed, under-resourced, and often inclined to defer to the charitable organisations who were, after all, doing the work of populating the country with British labour at minimal cost to the Canadian government. The inspection system that existed on paper often did not function on the ground. Children could spend years in a placement without any official visit. Children could be mistreated without any mechanism to report or escape the mistreatment. The specific experience of life as a home child in Canada varied enormously depending on the family with whom a child was placed. This is something that the survivors and their descendants are insistent about. Not all placements were bad. There were farmers in Ontario who genuinely took poor British children into their families, educated them, cared for them, and gave them a start in life that, whatever its flaws, was better than what they had left behind. There are descendants of home children who discovered their history and felt, on balance, that the migration had been in their ancestors' interests, but the proportion of difficult, damaging, or abusive placements was high. The system's incentive structures almost guaranteed it. Farmers who wanted cheap labour applied for home children. Organisations that received fees for each placement had no financial interest in removing a child from a placement that was not working. The children themselves had no standing to object. If a child complained to the placement inspector, the word of the child against the word of an established farmer was not a contest that favored the child. The most vulnerable children in the Canadian program were the girls. Girls were placed primarily as domestic servants. They worked in farmhouses and in the houses of small-town professionals and shopkeepers. They cooked, cleaned, washed, did laundry, cared for younger children in the households, and in many cases worked for no wages, only for board and keep. Their vulnerability to sexual exploitation was recognized by critics of the program from very early on. The records contain cases of girls who became pregnant by their employer or the employer's sons, who were then removed from the placement and placed elsewhere, with the pregnancy attributed to the girl's own moral failings rather than to the exploitation she had experienced. This pattern, the attribution to the child of the moral failure that produced their suffering, runs through the entire history of the child migration schemes like a poisoned thread. The children were the products of poverty. Poverty was moral failure. Therefore, the children were contaminated by moral failure. Therefore, when bad things happened to them, it was in some sense consistent with what was expected. The ideology that justified removing them from their original environment was the same ideology that made their suffering, in their new environment, comprehensible as something other than systemic failure. It was just the children's nature expressing itself. This is not an exaggeration. This reasoning appears explicitly in some of the documentary record. Children who were abused, who ran away, who stole food because they were hungry, who failed to thrive in their placements, were described in official documents as difficult, as having inherent character flaws, as demonstrating that even migration could not entirely overcome the inheritance of poverty. The possibility that the system itself was producing the outcomes it attributed to the children's nature was not one that the system was inclined to consider. Let us turn now to the specific story of what happened to the children sent to Australia after the Second World War, because this is the period that has received the most sustained public attention, the period that produced the formal inquiries, the government apologies, and the legal proceedings that brought the full scope of the child migration story into public consciousness. After 1945, Britain was rebuilding. The war had been devastating economically and socially. The welfare state was being constructed. The National Health Service was being established. But the mechanisms that had been used to manage poor children, the network of charitable institutions and religious homes, was still functioning. And in Australia, the demand for white British children to populate the Dominion was, if anything, more intense than it had been before the war. The post-war Australian government, under both Labor and coalition administrations, was deeply committed to the policy of populating the country with white immigrants. The slogan associated with this policy, "Populate or Perish," encapsulated the fear that Australia's small white population was vulnerable to the demographic reality of Asia. The White Australia policy was still in force, and British children, British orphans, British waifs were ideal candidates for populating the country in the right way. What neither the Australian government nor most of the British public knew, or at least could claim to know, was that the children being sent were not, in the majority of cases, orphans. A Senate inquiry conducted in Australia in 2001 found that the majority of children sent under the post-war migration schemes had at least one living parent. Some estimates place this figure at between 70 and 80%. The children were presented to the Australian authorities and to the Australian public as orphans, as children who had been abandoned, as the unwanted products of British poverty and social failure. This was the story that made the program possible. Without the orphan narrative, the program would have been much harder to sustain. The British government was not passive in this misrepresentation. The official records held by the British authorities were not made available to people searching for family members. Adoption records, institutional records, emigration records were kept confidential under policies that remained in force for decades. When survivors, as adults, attempted to access records about their own histories, they were frequently told that records were unavailable, had been destroyed, could not be located, or were confidential. The suggestion that these records might have been systematically withheld, or in some cases destroyed, to prevent the full scale of the program from becoming clear is not a fringe theory. It is a conclusion that has been reached by independent investigators, by parliamentary committees, and by the organisations themselves in some of their more candid moments. The Fairbridge Society, which continued sending children to its farm schools in Western Australia and southern Rhodesia into the 1960s, maintained records that were fragmentary, inconsistently kept, and in some cases unavailable for reasons that were never satisfactorily explained. Barnardo's records were more complete, and Barnardo's eventually, in the 1990s, took the significant step of opening their archives to adults who had been in their care, including those who had been migrated. This decision, combined with the advocacy of organizations representing child migration survivors, produced a flood of family reunions that would not otherwise have been possible. The reunions themselves are part of the history. They are among the most emotionally complex events in the entire story. When a person who has spent 40 or 50 years believing themselves to be an orphan, believing themselves to have been discarded and unwanted, discovers that they have a family, that they have siblings, that there are people in Britain who have been searching for them their entire lives, the experience is not, cannot be, simply joyful. It is joyful. It is also devastating. It is the revelation that the foundational story of your own life was a lie, and that the years that lie was in place cannot be reclaimed. There are recorded cases of survivors meeting siblings for the first time in their 50s and 60s. There are cases of survivors whose parents had died, who met nieces and nephews, and cousins who were strangers, who had grown up on one side of the world while they grew up on the other, who shared blood but no history. There are cases of siblings who had been separated and sent to different institutions, in some cases in different countries, who had spent their childhoods in the same program without knowing the other existed. One case that was documented in detail by journalists and later by parliamentary investigators involved a man referred to in public testimony as David, whose surname was withheld for his privacy, who had been sent from Britain to a Catholic institution in Western Australia at the age of 5 in 1952. David had spent his entire childhood being told he was an orphan. He had grown up, left the institution, married, had children of his own, built a life. In 1995, when he was 48 years old, he requested his records from the institution. The records revealed that he had a mother, who was still alive, in Birmingham, and a sister, who was 3 years older than him, who had been placed in a different institution in England when David was sent to Australia. David travelled to Birmingham. His mother was 71 years old. She had spent 43 years believing her son had died in the institution where she had placed him, during a period of severe illness, because that was what she had been told. The meeting between them was documented with David's permission by a journalist. It was, by any description, a meeting between two people who were strangers to each other, who shared biology and the knowledge of an enormous wrong done to them, and nothing else. His mother died 2 years later. David's sister, found through the same record search, had her own history of damage and loss. That was hers and not his. They were connected now by what had been done to them. They were not the family they would have been if what had been done to them had not been done. The Australian Senate inquiry of 2001, the Lost Innocents Report, was the first formal government investigation to fully examine the post-war Australian child migration program. It took testimony from hundreds of survivors. It reviewed thousands of pages of documentary evidence. Its findings were extensive and damning. The inquiry found that children had been sent to Australia under false pretenses regarding their family status. It found that the institutions receiving children had failed to provide adequate care, education, or welfare oversight. It found that physical and sexual abuse had been widespread at multiple institutions, particularly those run by the Christian Brothers. It found that governments on both sides of the world, Australian and British, had been aware of complaints and concerns about the program and had failed to act on them. It found that records had been inadequately maintained and, in some cases, deliberately withheld in ways that had denied survivors their right to know their own history. On the basis of these findings, the inquiry made a series of recommendations that included formal apologies from the governments of both countries, financial assistance for survivors wishing to travel to Britain to search for family members, and the establishment of a formal scheme to assist in family tracing. The Australian government's formal apology was delivered by Prime Minister Kevin Rudd in November 2009. It followed his famous 2008 apology to the stolen generations of Aboriginal Australians, and it was, in its substance and its emotional weight, one of the most significant public acknowledgements of institutional wrongdoing in recent Australian history. Rudd stood in the House of Representatives in Canberra and said, in language that had been carefully prepared but that also seemed to carry real feeling, that Australia was sorry. Sorry for the children who had been brought to this country under false pretenses, who had been separated from their families, who had been told they were unloved and unwanted. Sorry for the abuse they had suffered in institutions that bore responsibility for their care. Sorry for the decades in which their experiences had not been believed or acknowledged. He said that Australia should have known better. He said that Australia should have done better. In the public gallery, watching, were dozens of survivors, many of them elderly, many of them weeping. Some of them had waited 60 or 70 years for someone in authority to say those words. Some of them did not feel the apology was sufficient. Some felt it was important, but incomplete. Some felt it was too late. The British government's apology came 6 months later, in February 2010, delivered by Prime Minister Gordon Brown in the House of Commons. Brown expressed deep regret for what he called a shameful episode in the history of this country. He acknowledged that the children had deserved better. He announced funding for a travel scheme that would enable survivors to return to Britain to search for family members. The surviving organisations, when they issued their own apologies, did so in language that varied significantly in the degree of responsibility they accepted. Barnardo's, to its credit, issued an unequivocal apology that took full responsibility for the harm caused by its migration programs. The Catholic Church's apologies were more varied and, in the judgment of many survivors, less complete. The Christian Brothers, in particular, were the subject of ongoing litigation even after the formal apologies. Survivors of the Western Australian institutions pursued legal claims for compensation. The proceedings were long, expensive, and emotionally punishing for the plaintiffs. The Christian Brothers argued, in some cases, that claims were time-barred, that the perpetrators were dead, that the organisation was not legally liable for the actions of individual members. These arguments were pursued even as the organisation acknowledged, in general terms, that abuse had occurred. Some survivors settled for amounts that felt, to many of them, inadequate to the scale of what had been done to them. Others continued to litigate. Some died before their cases were resolved. The litigation continues in various forms to this day. But the legal proceedings, important as they are, do not fully capture what the survivors experienced or what they lost. The courts can award compensation for identifiable harms. They can find organisations liable for specific abuses. What they cannot do is give back the childhood, the family, the identity, the years of not knowing who you are or where you come from. The law does not have a remedy for the theft of a person's history. What the history of the child migration schemes reveals, when you look at it as a whole, is a collision between two powerful forces. On one side, the ideological conviction of the charitable and religious organisations and the governments that supported them, that they knew best, that the children of the poor were better served by institutional care and imperial dispersal than by remaining with their families in conditions of poverty. On the other side, the basic human reality, that family connection, even imperfect family connection, even poverty-stricken family connection, is not a luxury that can be stripped from a child without causing damage. The first force won for a century. It won because it had institutional power, financial resources, government backing, and ideological confidence. The second force eventually won because it was true, because the evidence of the damage could not eventually be suppressed, and because the survivors themselves, despite everything that had been done to silence and diminish them, found their voices. There is a generation of people, now mostly in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, living in Australia and Canada and Britain and Rhodesia and New Zealand, who carry the experience of child migration in their bodies, in their histories, in the relationships they formed and failed to form, in the way they understand themselves. Some of them have found family, some of them have not. Some of them have made peace, or something like peace, with what was done to them. Some of them have not been able to do that. All of them carry the weight of a decision that was made for them, about them, by institutions and governments that did not treat their humanity as a value worth protecting. To understand the full scope of this history, it is necessary to understand not just what was done, but how it was justified, and then how it was defended, even as the evidence of its failure accumulated. Because the history of the child migration schemes is not simply a history of cruelty or neglect. It is a history of a system that was defended with sincerity and conviction by people who believed in it, who had staked their institutional identities on it, and who could not or would not revise their belief in the face of contradicting evidence. The philanthropic organizations that ran the schemes had, by the time the first serious criticisms appeared, enormous institutional investments in the program's success. They had built organizations, raised funds, cultivated donors and government supporters by presenting child migration as a humanitarian achievement. The story they told was a compelling one. Poor children rescued from degradation, new lives in clean, prosperous lands. Young Britons building the empire. It was a story that people wanted to believe, because it allowed the discomfort of Britain's urban poverty to be resolved, narratively, without requiring fundamental changes to the economic structures that produced it. When the criticisms came, when the Doyle Report in 1875 raised questions about conditions in Canadian placements, when journalists and social workers began to document cases of abuse and exploitation, the organization's response was consistent. The criticisms were exaggerated. The bad cases were exceptional. The overall program was functioning well and producing positive outcomes. The critics did not understand the scale of the benefit being conferred or the severity of the alternative, which was leaving these children in the slums of Britain. This last argument was the most powerful rhetorical tool the organizations had, and they used it consistently for decades. Whatever problems might exist in the migration program, the alternative was worse. The alternative was leaving a child in poverty, in a workhouse, in an environment of moral contamination. Whatever suffering a child might experience in a Canadian farm placement or an Australian institution, it was better than that. This argument was very difficult to refute because it contained, for some children, a grain of truth. Some children did come from circumstances so severe that even the worst of the migration placements represented an improvement in material terms. But the argument was also used to deflect attention from cases where the comparison did not hold, where the child had had a family capable of caring for them, where the original poverty was temporary and remediable, where the migration had taken a child from bad circumstances and made them worse. The argument that the alternative was worse also implicitly accepted a binary choice that did not actually exist. The choice was not simply between leaving a child in a slum or sending them to Australia. The choice included keeping the child in Britain under supervised care, improving the material circumstances of the family, addressing the structural poverty that was the root cause of the problem. These options were considered by the organizations and by most of their government supporters to be either impractical or insufficiently transformative. The ideological commitment to the transformative power of migration, the belief that environment was destiny and that a new environment meant a new destiny, made the alternatives seem inadequate. Why keep a child in Britain, even in better conditions, when you could send them to a new world? The answer, which took a century to fully emerge, is because they were not yours to send. This question of ownership and authority is at the heart of everything. The organizations that ran the migration schemes operated effectively on the assumption that they had acquired custody of these children, and with it, the right to make fundamental decisions about their lives. This assumption was not always legally grounded. In many cases, the consent that had been obtained for a child's placement in an institution did not extend to permanent emigration. In some cases, no consent had been obtained at all. In some cases, the legal frameworks governing child welfare were sufficiently vague that organizations with enough institutional authority could act without explicit consent and be confident that no court would challenge them. The parents who were deceived, the parents who were told their children had died, who were given false information about where their children had gone, who were refused information when they inquired, were not without legal rights in theory. In practice, those rights were unenforceable against organizations that had government backing, had legal representation, and had possession of both the children and the paperwork. The poverty that had made these parents vulnerable in the first place continued to make them vulnerable when they tried to challenge the institutions that had taken their children. There is a concept in moral philosophy called structural injustice, the idea that harm can be produced not by individual malice, but by the operation of systems and institutions that, taken as a whole, consistently disadvantage certain groups of people in ways that cannot be reduced to the bad intentions of particular actors. The child migration schemes are a case study in structural injustice. Most of the people who ran them were not, individually, evil people. They were people operating within a system that reflected the values and assumptions of their time and class, a system that had been built to manage poor children according to principles that were sincerely held and internally consistent. The harm that system produced was not, in most cases, intended. It was, in most cases, not even perceived as harm by the people producing it. It was perceived as benefit, as rescue, as transformation. But the children experienced it as harm. The parents experienced it as loss. And the descendants of those children and parents in Australia and Canada and Britain today carry in their family histories the evidence of what structural sincerity, untempered by accountability, can produce. The post-war period in Australia saw the most intensive phase of the child migration program. Between 1945 and 1967, approximately 10,000 children were sent from Britain to Australia under various schemes. The Australian government paid a subsidy of approximately £10 per child to the sending organisations. The receiving institutions, many of them operated by religious orders, received ongoing funding from the Australian government for each child in their care. The financial incentives ran in one direction, toward receiving more children, not toward ensuring the welfare of the children received. The conditions in the post-war Australian institutions have been documented extensively. They ranged from poor to catastrophic. The diet at many institutions was inadequate, both in quantity and nutritional quality. Former residents of institutions in Western Australia described meals consisting primarily of bread and dripping, watery porridge, and occasionally salt beef. Former residents described being hungry, chronically, not acutely, not on the edge of starvation, but persistently underfed in a way that affected their physical development and their ability to concentrate and learn. Education at many institutions was minimal. Children were required to attend school, but the schools were frequently within the institution, staffed by brothers or sisters, whose teaching qualifications were questionable, whose attention was divided between teaching and institutional management, and whose methods relied heavily on rote learning and physical discipline. Children who left the institutions as teenagers, as they were expected to do, sometimes had effective literacy and numeracy at the level of 8 or 9-year-olds, despite being 15 or 16 years of age. The combination of inadequate nutrition, minimal education, physical punishment, emotional deprivation, and in many cases sexual abuse, created in the children of these institutions a pattern of damage that manifested in their adult lives in predictable and well-documented ways. High rates of mental health difficulties, high rates of problematic alcohol and drug use, difficulties forming stable relationships, difficulties in employment, difficulties with the basic bureaucratic functions of adult life, obtaining credit, maintaining housing, navigating official institutions, in people who had been failed by, and in some cases, actively harmed by official institutions. The survivors who gave testimony to the various inquiries and investigations described these effects with a clarity and consistency that was itself the product of long reflection. They had spent decades trying to understand why their lives were the way they were. They had, many of them, carried shame about their own difficulties before they understood the context that explained those difficulties. The process of giving testimony, of having their experiences officially documented and acknowledged, was for many of them the first time they had been given a framework within which their suffering made sense, not as personal failure, but as the predictable consequence of what had been done to them. The Canadian program ended in 1939, as already noted, when the war closed the shipping lanes. Canada did not have an equivalent post-war program. The home children who had come to Canada between 1869 and 1939 had by then grown up, had had children of their own, had in many cases assimilated into Canadian society to the extent that their British origins and the circumstances of their arrival were not widely known. The stigma attached to being a home child was, in many families, something that was not talked about. There are Canadian families today in which the home child ancestry was kept secret for generations because of the shame associated with being a pauper child, a charity child, someone who had come without family, without history, without the normal markers of respectable social origin. This silence around home child identity began to break down in the 1980s and 1990s, partly because of the attention being given to the Australian program, partly because of the growth of genealogical research as a cultural phenomenon, and partly because of the advocacy of organisations like the British Home Children Group, which became a significant force in making the history visible and in helping descendants understand what their ancestors had experienced. The Canadian government issued a formal acknowledgement of the Home Children Programme in 2009, following the Australian apology. It was, by most accounts, somewhat less fulsome than the Australian and British statements, but it represented an official recognition that the programme had caused harm and that this harm deserved to be acknowledged. The question of what adequate acknowledgement looks like, when the harm in question occurred across a century and affected 150,000 children, is one that does not have a clear answer. The formal apologies were important. The financial assistance programs for family tracing were important. The archival opening that allowed survivors to access their own records was important. None of these things is sufficient, because sufficiency in a case of this kind is probably impossible. You cannot undo what was done. You can name it. You can acknowledge it. you can try to ensure that the conditions that made it possible do not recur. The conditions that made it possible have not entirely disappeared. This is worth saying clearly. The fundamental dynamics of the child migration schemes, powerful institutions with ideological confidence, removing children from poor, vulnerable families on the grounds that they know better what is good for those children, are not unique to the 19th and early 20th centuries. They have analogues in contemporary child welfare systems. They have analogues in the policies regarding Indigenous children that produced the stolen generations in Australia and the 60s scoop in Canada. They are not gone from the world. The specific form they took in the child migration schemes is gone, but the underlying logic persists. And it is worth understanding it clearly, precisely because it persists. The specific story of the child migration schemes also has a living dimension that is easy to lose sight of amid the historical analysis. There are survivors still alive. There are elderly people in Western Australia and Ontario and the suburbs of British cities who carry this history in their bodies. There are family reunions that are still happening, still being mediated, still producing the complicated, irreplaceable experiences of people who have found each other after decades of separation, caused by decisions made by powerful institutions that did not consult them. There are also descendants. The children of the home children and the child migrants who went to Australia are, in many cases, living with inheritances they only partially understand. There is a growing body of research on intergenerational trauma, the ways in which unprocessed experiences of displacement, abuse, and identity loss are transmitted across generations, not genetically, but through the mechanisms of family relationship, parenting style, the stories that are and are not told, the absences that are and are not acknowledged. The descendants of the child migrants carry some of this, though the form it takes is different for each family and each individual. Some descendants have become active advocates for the survivors and for the history. The British Home Children Advocacy and Research Association, organisations in Australia that support survivors and advocate for better record access. The work of journalists and filmmakers and novelists who have given artistic form to this history. These represent an ongoing engagement with what happened that keeps the history alive and meaningful, rather than allowing it to settle into the comfortable category of the past. The discomfort of this history, if you are British, is real, and it should be real. The child migration schemes were not an aberration, not a departure from the normal values of British society. They were the expression of those values, of the class assumptions, and the imperial logic, and the philanthropic self-confidence that were central to how Britain understood itself for 100 years. They were supported by government policy, funded by public donations, administered by organisations that received the Queen's Award and the patronage of royalty and the approval of successive administrations of every political complexion. The charities involved did not operate secretly. They published annual reports. They held fundraising events. They sent spokespersons to lecture in church halls and public meetings about the good they were doing. They were celebrated. Barnardo's, which today is one of the most prominent and genuinely well-regarded children's charities in Britain, built much of its early reputation on the child migration program. The tension between acknowledging the historical harm of the migration program and the genuine good that Barnardo's has done since is one that the organisation has had to manage carefully, and to its credit has largely managed with integrity. The church organisations, particularly the Catholic ones, have had a harder time. The combination of the migration programme's harms with the sexual abuse revelations has made the institutional reckoning more complex and more painful. The Catholic Church in Australia has been through an extensive, brutal, and still unfinished process of confronting what was done in its institutions. The Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, which began in 2013 and ran for 5 years, examined the Catholic Church's record in detail and found evidence of abuse at scale across multiple institutions and decades, including many of the institutions that had received child migrants. The Royal Commission's findings reinforced what survivors had been saying for decades, that the abuse was not isolated, that it was systematic, that it was enabled by the closed, unaccountable nature of the institutions, by the power of religious authority over isolated children, and by the culture of silence and institutional self-protection that surrounded it. The Commission made recommendations for structural reform that have had significant effects on how religious institutions in Australia are governed and how they respond to abuse allegations. But the Commission, also by its nature, focused primarily on sexual abuse rather than on the broader story of displacement, family separation, and identity erasure that constitutes the full scope of what was done to child migrants. The migration program was a wrong even before the abuse. The abuse was an additional and devastating wrong, layered on top of the original wrong. Understanding the full scale of the harm requires holding both of these truths simultaneously. Let us return for a moment to the children themselves, to what it was actually like to be a child arriving in Australia or Canada, stepping off a ship, knowing nothing of where you were going or what would happen to you. The testimonies given by survivors described the arrival experience with remarkable consistency. There was confusion, there was fear, there was a desperate effort to understand where you were and what the rules of this new place were. For the children arriving in Australia, particularly those sent to remote institutions in Western Australia, the landscape was alien in ways that were almost physically disorienting. The heat, the red earth, the eucalyptus trees that did not look like anything they had ever seen, the enormous sky, everything unfamiliar, with nothing familiar to hold on to. The brothers or sisters who received them were, in most cases, strangers who were also authority figures, which meant that whatever one felt about them, one was required to obey them. The other children in the institution were also strangers, but they had been through the same experience and they understood it. Former residents described the complex social world of the institutions, the hierarchies among the children, the older ones with more institutional knowledge and more power, the younger ones trying to work out where they stood, the bonds of solidarity that formed among children who were in the same situation. Those bonds were, for many survivors, the most valuable thing they took away from the institutions. Relationships forged in shared difficulty, in the specific intimacy of children who have only each other, that lasted for decades. Former residents of Bindoon and Castledare and Fairbridge describe going back to visit other former residents, attending reunions, maintaining friendships across distances of thousands of miles and decades of separate lives. These friendships are, in their way, a testament to the children's capacity for connection, even in conditions designed to make connection difficult. But the friendships could not substitute for family, could not provide what family provides, the sense of origin, the specific love that comes from being known from the beginning, the biological and historical continuity that gives a person a place in the world. The children's bonds with each other were something they made for themselves, from nothing, in the absence of what should have been given to them. They are admirable. They are also evidence of the depth of what was taken. There is a question that historians and journalists and advocates have returned to repeatedly over the years of engagement with this history. Could the people running these schemes have known? Could they have looked at what they were doing and recognized it as wrong? Or did the ideology of the time genuinely prevent them from seeing it? The honest answer is that both things were true for different people and in different degrees. There were people running these schemes who were, by any standard, sincere believers in what they were doing, who could not see the harm because their ideological framework rendered it invisible. There were also people who knew, or suspected, or had been told, that things were not as they claimed, and who chose to continue anyway because the institutional investment was too great, because admitting the problems would have undermined the funding base, because the alternative of confronting what they had done and were doing was more than they were willing to face. The records that have been examined, the internal communications of some of the organisations, the correspondence between British and Australian authorities, the inspectors' reports that were filed and never acted upon, suggest that there was more knowledge at the institutional level than the official narrative acknowledged. There were cases that were investigated internally and suppressed. There were complaints that were received, documented and filed away. There were reports from placement inspectors that described conditions the organisation's public communications would not have recognised. The gap between what was known internally and what was presented publicly is evidence of something that goes beyond mere ideological blindness. It is evidence of a choice made by institutions with power over powerless people to protect the institution rather than the people in its care. This is not unique to the child migration schemes. It is a pattern that appears in the history of institutional failure generally, from the Catholic Church's response to abuse allegations, to the histories of state residential schools for Indigenous children, to the records of workhouses and orphanages and asylums across the 19th and 20th centuries. Institutions with total power over vulnerable people, insulated from external accountability, tend over time to prioritize their own survival and reputation over the welfare of the people they are supposed to serve. This is not a law of nature. It is not inevitable. But it is common enough that it should be regarded as a structural risk, a predictable failure mode that requires specific institutional and legal countermeasures to prevent. The countermeasures that were supposed to exist in the child migration schemes, the inspection systems, the government oversight, the consent requirements, the follow-up visits, failed systematically. They failed for reasons that included under-resourcing, administrative indifference, ideological alignment between the overseers and the overseen, and in some cases, active complicity. The lesson that this history offers to anyone thinking about the governance of institutions that care for vulnerable children is not subtle. External accountability, genuine accountability with real teeth, with real resources, with real willingness to act on what is found, is not optional. Without it, the institution's interest in its own self-preservation will, over time, override its interest in the welfare of the people in its care. This lesson is still being learned. It is still being applied, imperfectly and with great difficulty, to the institutions that care for vulnerable children today. The child migration schemes are not simply a story about the past. They are a story about the conditions under which institutions fail, and those conditions have not disappeared. The physical experience of being a child migrant did not end when children left the institutions at 15 or 16 years old. In most cases, they left with very little. They had no savings because they had not been paid for their labor in the institutions. They had limited education. They had no family to go to. Many of them had been in institutional care from an age so young that they had no experience of living independently, no knowledge of how to cook for themselves, navigate a city, manage money, find work. They had been trained for one thing, farm labor or domestic service, and trained for little else. They were released into a society that they did not know, in a country that was not the country of their birth, as strangers. Some of them managed. The stories of former child migrants who built successful lives, who established families and businesses and communities, who assimilated into Australian or Canadian society and flourished, are real and should not be denied. The human capacity for resilience is extraordinary. The ability of some people to build stable, productive, meaningful lives on foundations of damage and deprivation is one of the most remarkable things about human experience. But the evidence from surveys, from mental health records, from the testimony of survivors, and the research of those who have studied the survivor population, is that the baseline rates of difficulty in this population are significantly elevated. Elevated rates of depression and anxiety, elevated rates of post-traumatic stress, elevated rates of difficulty in relationships and parenting, elevated rates of economic disadvantage. These are the statistical shadow of what was done, visible in population data even when individual stories are more varied. There is also the specific difficulty of identity. The question of who you are when your history has been removed from you is not merely philosophical, it is practical. It affects how you present yourself to the world, how you understand your own behavior and emotions, how you relate to your own children, what stories you tell about yourself and whether you believe them. Former child migrants describe the experience of building a self without a foundation, of constructing an identity from whatever materials were available, knowing all the while that something essential was missing, something that other people seemed to have automatically that had been deliberately taken from them. The question of cultural identity is particularly complex for the Australian child migrants. Many of them came from specific communities in Britain, from particular streets and neighbourhoods and working-class cultures that had their own customs, dialects, values, and ways of being. They were removed from those cultures before they had fully formed within them, and they were placed in Australian institutional environments that had no particular interest in maintaining any connection to British working-class culture. Some of them, by the time they were adults, felt themselves to be neither fully Australian nor meaningfully British, neither at home in the country of their birth nor at home in the country where they had grown up. This displacement is not unique to child migrants. It is an experience that many immigrants and diaspora communities share, but it has a specific quality in the child migration case because it was not chosen. It was imposed. The children did not decide to leave Britain. They were taken. The cultural dislocation is not the cost of a decision they made about their own lives. It is the cost of a decision made for them by people who did not have the right to make it. As we move through the 21st century, the survivors of the post-war Australian child migration program are now mostly in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. The survivors of the earlier programs, the Canadian home children, the children sent in the 1920s and 1930s, are mostly gone. The history is passing out of living memory in a way that requires active effort to preserve. The organizations that serve survivors, the researchers and historians and journalists who have documented this history, the advocates who keep it in public consciousness, are engaged in a race against time. The archives hold an enormous amount. The records that have been opened, partially or fully, contain the names and stories of thousands of children whose individual experiences have not yet been examined. There is historical work still to be done, family connections still to be made, truths still to be retrieved from the documents. The work of understanding what happened is not finished. And the descendants of the child migrants, the second and third generation Australians and Canadians who carry this history in their family trees, are increasingly seeking to understand it. The genealogical impulse is powerful in these communities. The knowledge that there is a story, a suppressed, complicated, difficult story in the generation above or 2 generations above, creates a pull toward understanding. What happened to my grandfather? Why didn't he talk about his family in England? Who are the people whose names appear in these old letters that no one can explain? The questions that weren't asked when they could have been asked directly are being asked now through archives and records and the increasingly sophisticated tools of genetic genealogy. What they are finding, when they find it, is a history that is painful and complex and that requires holding several contradictory things simultaneously. That genuine care and devastating harm can coexist in the same institution. That ideology can produce wrong while feeling like virtue. That structural systems can multiply individual human failures into something larger and more lasting than any individual could have created. That children are not the property of the institutions that house them, and that this truth, obvious as it sounds, was not obvious enough to 100 years of governments and charities and churches that needed it to be otherwise. The last children sent under the British Child Migration Programme arrived in Australia in 1970. 56 years ago, as of the time this is being made. That is not long. There is nothing about the year 1970 that is historically remote. It is within the living memory of hundreds of millions of people. The child migration program did not end because it was exposed, or because a court found it unlawful, or because a government decided it was wrong. It ended because the ideological and demographic conditions that had sustained it gradually changed. The White Australia policy was being dismantled. The welfare state had changed the landscape of child poverty in Britain. The social work profession was developing a more robust framework for thinking about family preservation and child welfare. The idea that the children of poor parents were best served by being removed from their parents and sent to distant countries to become imperial labour. This idea was losing its hold. But it lost its hold slowly, and for reasons that were not primarily the welfare of the children involved. The children's welfare, in the end, was peripheral to the decision-making throughout. It was peripheral when the programs began. It was peripheral when concerns were raised. And it was peripheral when the programs ended. The children were means to ends throughout. Means to imperial population goals. Means to institutional fundraising goals. Means to the charitable self-conception of the organizations that claimed to be their benefactors. This is the hardest thing to sit with, that 150,000 children were treated as means rather than ends, as instruments of policies and ideologies that had nothing to do with their individual humanity, and that this happened in the name of helping them, that the language used to describe what was done to them was the language of rescue and opportunity and transformation, that the people who did it could, in many cases, tell themselves and their donors and their governments and their God that they were doing good. The gap between what was claimed and what was true is not unique to child migration. It is a recurring feature of the history of institutional treatment of the vulnerable. But it is particularly sharp here, because the idealism was so genuine and the harm was so large, because the language of rescue was so thoroughly applied to something that was, in so many cases, its opposite. The children deserve to have their story told accurately, not as a story of Victorian cruelty, not as a story of individual monsters, not as a story that ended with the apologies and the financial assistance programs, but as a story that is still ongoing, still alive in the people who carry it and the communities shaped by it, still relevant to the question of what societies owe to their most vulnerable members and the institutions in which those members are placed. They were children, they were poor, they had parents, in most cases. They were told the wrong story about themselves and then required to live inside it, in foreign countries, in institutions that held enormous power over them for the entirety of their childhoods. When they emerged, they carried the weight of what had been done to them in ways that shaped not just their own lives, but the lives of their children and grandchildren. And for most of a century, almost no one in authority was willing to say clearly what that weight was, where it had come from, and who bore responsibility for placing it there. We know now. The inquiries have been held, the apologies have been made, the archives are more open than they were. What remains is the obligation that knowledge creates. To remember accurately, to tell the truth without evasion, and to understand clearly enough what happened to ensure, as much as any generation can ensure anything, that the logic that produced it does not find new forms in new centuries. 150,000 children, most of them with living parents, sent to the other side of the world by the most powerful and most Christian civilization on earth, in the name of their own good. This is their history. It belongs to them, and it belongs to all of us who share the society that made it possible. If you have found this history important, please share it with someone who should know it. Leave a comment below. Tell me what part of this story has stayed with you. The survivors who gave their testimony so that this history could be understood deserve to know that it is still being heard, and that the truth they spent their lives trying to establish has not been forgotten. The Scottish dimension of the child migration story deserves particular attention because Scotland produced some of the most significant sending organisations, and because the Scottish experience of emigration, both voluntary and coerced, gives the child migration schemes a specific cultural resonance. William Quarrier was a Glasgow businessman who, like Annie Macpherson, had been profoundly affected by his encounters with the destitute children of a Victorian industrial city. In 1871, he opened his first home for street children in Glasgow. By the 1870s, he had established the Orphan Homes of Scotland at Bridge of Weir in Renfrewshire, a model village of cottages where children were housed in family-sized groups under cottage parents. The Quarrier homes, as they came to be known, were genuinely innovative for their time. The cottage system was an attempt to provide something closer to family life than the large institutional dormitory model, and in this respect, they represented a genuine philanthropic advance. Quarrier also sent children to Canada. He began his emigration program in 1872, and over the following decades sent approximately 7,000 children to Ontario. Like Macpherson and Barnardo, he believed in the transformative potential of Canadian rural life. Unlike some of the other sending organisations, Quarrier made efforts, at least initially, to maintain some contact with the children whom he sent and to investigate complaints. But the structural problems of the system, the distance, the dependence on Canadian receiving agents, the absence of meaningful oversight, meant that the outcomes were not reliably better than those of the other organisations. The Quarrier homes continued after William Quarrier's death in 1903 and continued to send children to Canada until the Second World War. In the post-war period, they did not resume emigration, but continued to operate as residential care homes in Scotland. The Quarriers organisation, which today operates as a social care charity, has in recent decades acknowledged the harm done by its historical emigration program and has worked with former residents to provide access to records and to facilitate family tracing. The specific story of the Quarriers' children in Canada intersects with a broader story about the Scottish diaspora and Scottish working-class culture that is worth noting. Many of the children sent from Scotland carried with them accents, expressions, fragments of culture that made them recognizable to other Scots in Canada. That created small communities of connection across the vast distances of Canadian geography. Former residents of the Quarrier homes in Ontario have described the experience of encountering other Quarriers' children, recognizing each other by speech or by the specific institutional habits they had acquired, and forming the kind of instant, wordless solidarity that comes from shared experience. These connections were, for some of them, the closest thing to community they had in their early years in Canada. The story of the Catholic child migrants requires a longer examination than it sometimes receives in the general literature, partly because the Catholic program had some distinctive features, and partly because the Catholic Church's subsequent reckoning with the abuse in its institutions has, in some respects, overshadowed the earlier story of the migration itself. The Catholic child migration program was organized primarily around the goal of providing Catholic children to Catholic institutions in countries where the Church was building its presence. The Australian Catholic hierarchy was particularly active in soliciting British children during the post-war period. Cardinal Hinsley, the Archbishop of Westminster, and his successors gave strong support to schemes that would populate Catholic institutions in Australia with Catholic children, children who would be raised in the faith, who would form the foundation of a Catholic community in a country where Catholics were a significant but not dominant presence. The organizations involved in Catholic child migration included the Catholic Emigration Association, various diocesan organizations, and the Christian Brothers, who ran institutions in Western Australia, and the Sisters of Mercy and other female religious orders who ran girls' institutions in multiple Australian states. The coordination between British Catholic authorities and Australian receiving institutions was, in some respects, more systematic than in the Protestant programs. Specific numbers of children were requested, specific ages and types were specified, and the British organisations worked to fill the Australian institutions' requirements. What this meant in practice was that the selection of children for migration was sometimes driven by the institution's needs rather than the children's welfare. If an institution needed a certain number of boys of a certain age to do farm work, the British organisation would find children of that age, sometimes taking them from families or circumstances that did not clearly warrant their removal. The welfare of the individual child was, in these cases, secondary to the institutional requirement. The girls who were sent to Catholic institutions in Australia were placed on leaving the institutions, primarily in domestic service in the households of Catholic families. The placement system, while different from the Canadian farm placement model, had many of the same structural problems. Girls were placed in households where they were domestic workers, not family members. Their wages, when they were paid at all, were sometimes withheld or paid directly to the institution rather than to the girl herself. Their freedom of movement was restricted. Their ability to leave a bad placement was limited by their lack of resources, their limited knowledge of Australian society, and the Church's authority over their lives. The specific experience of girls in Catholic institutions in Australia has been less thoroughly documented than the experience of boys, partly because girls were more difficult to organise as a collective and partly because the patterns of abuse they experienced were somewhat different. The physical violence that characterised the boys' institutions was less prevalent in the girls, but other forms of control and exploitation, including the appropriation of wages, the restriction of personal freedom, and in some cases, sexual abuse, were documented by the Senate inquiry and by subsequent investigations. There is a particular figure who appears in many accounts of the Australian child migration program, not because she was a perpetrator of abuse, but because she was one of the first people to investigate it, systematically, from within the institutional world. Margaret Humphreys was a Nottingham social worker who in 1986 was approached by a woman who had been sent to Australia as a child and who was trying to find her family. Humphreys had no knowledge of the child migration schemes. She began, as a social worker would, to investigate the case. And what she found, as she pulled on the thread, was a story that was larger than she had imagined, and that had been largely invisible to everyone outside the survivor community. Humphreys established what became the Child Migrants Trust in 1987. The trust was dedicated to providing social work support to former child migrants and to facilitating family reunions. In the years that followed, it mediated thousands of contacts between survivors in Australia and family members in Britain, organised travel for elderly survivors to return to Britain, and provided counsellings and support for the complex emotional experiences that followed. Humphreys wrote a book about her experiences, Empty Cradles, published in 1994, which brought the child migration story to a wide British public for the first time. The book was subsequently adapted for a television film starring Emily Watson that further extended its reach. The response to Empty Cradles was significant. It generated a large number of inquiries, from people who recognised elements of their own story or their family's story in what Humphreys described. It prompted media investigation that produced further documentation, and it created political pressure that eventually led to the formal parliamentary inquiries that produced the Lost Innocents report and ultimately the government apologies. Humphreys herself has been a significant figure in the long process of pushing governments and organizations to take responsibility. Her work, and the work of the Child Migrants Trust, represents one of the more positive elements of this history, an example of what dedicated, skilled, and compassionate advocacy can achieve against institutional resistance. The Trust continues to operate, providing services to an aging survivor population and maintaining the institutional memory of the migration schemes. The question of New Zealand and Rhodesia, the other destinations for British child migrants, deserves at least brief attention. New Zealand received several thousand children under various schemes during the 19th and early 20th centuries. The conditions in New Zealand placements were broadly similar to those in Canada: rural farm and domestic service placements with variable quality oversight. New Zealand has been somewhat slower than Australia and Canada to formally reckon with this history, though there has been significant historical research and some public acknowledgement. Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, received children primarily through the Fairbridge program, which operated farm schools in southern Rhodesia in parallel with those in Western Australia. The Rhodesian schools had a particular character shaped by the colonial context. Children who were being trained to be settlers in a white minority-governed African country. Children who were, from the perspective of the colonial administration, valuable precisely because they were white and British. The post-colonial history of Zimbabwe has made the specific story of the Fairbridge children in Rhodesia more complicated and in some respects more inaccessible than the Australian stories. The international dimensions of the child migration story are worth holding in mind because they complicate any simple national narrative. This is not simply a British story or an Australian story or a Canadian story. It is a story about the British Empire, about the way the empire functioned as a system for redistributing people and resources, including the human resources of poor children, in service of imperial goals. The children were moved across the empire as if the empire were a single administrative unit, which in some respects it was. The national apologies, welcome as they were, could not fully capture the imperial logic that made the program possible, because the empire that operated that logic no longer exists. The relationship between the child migration schemes and the parallel story of Aboriginal child removal in Australia is one that historians have begun to examine more carefully in recent years. The stolen generations, the systematic removal of Aboriginal and mixed heritage children from their families by Australian government authorities and church organisations, was operating in the same period and often in the same geographical space as the child migration program. There are cases where the same institutions, the same brothers and sisters, the same administrative apparatus was involved in both programs. The ideological connections are significant. Both programs were predicated on the belief that removal from family and community was beneficial for children. Both programs were predicated on the belief that the institutions removing children knew better than the parents what was good for the children. Both programs caused enormous multi-generational harm. The differences are also significant. The Aboriginal child removal was explicitly racially motivated in a way that the child migration program was not. The child migration program was, in the context of White Australia policy, actually part of the effort to prevent the demographic presence of Aboriginal Australians from being reflected in the population statistics. And the Aboriginal children who were removed had an existing culture, language, and community from which they were being separated, a culture that the removing authorities were explicitly trying to destroy, whereas the British child migrants were being removed from poverty rather than from a thriving culture. These distinctions matter, but what they share is more important for understanding both programs. They share the fundamental feature of powerful institutions treating children as means rather than ends. They share the feature of those institutions justifying their actions through ideologies of improvement and rescue. They share the feature of systematic dishonesty about what was being done and why, and they share the feature of harm that was denied and suppressed for decades before being formally acknowledged. Australia's engagement with both histories simultaneously, the child migration and the stolen generations, has produced a particular cultural moment in which the question of institutional accountability to vulnerable children is alive in public discourse in a way that it is not in many other countries. The Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, already mentioned, was partly a product of this broader reckoning. It was also one of the most comprehensive and unflinching public examinations of institutional child abuse in any country's history. The specific contribution of journalists to the public understanding of child migration is worth acknowledging. In Britain and Australia, investigative journalists working in the 1980s and 1990s did the work that official investigations eventually confirmed. They found survivors. They obtained documents. They published stories that were uncomfortable for powerful institutions and that those institutions would have preferred not to see published. The journalist David Hill, who was himself a former resident of the Barnardo's Farm School at Mowbray Park in New South Wales, wrote extensively about the Australian child migration program and used his own experience to connect the official history to the individual human stories that gave it meaning. Other journalists in Britain and Australia produced reports that, taken together, created the public understanding, without which the parliamentary inquiries would not have been possible. The role of television documentaries was equally significant. Several documentary films produced in the 1990s and early 2000s brought survivor testimony directly to general audiences in ways that written journalism could not. Seeing and hearing elderly people describe their experiences as children, seeing their faces as they talked about what had been done to them, had an impact that transcended the factual and emotional into something more immediate. Several of these documentaries were instrumental in prompting specific individuals who had been silent about their histories to come forward, and in prompting family members to begin searching for relatives they had not known existed. The political process that produced the formal apologies was long and was not straightforward. In Britain, the key advocacy was done by a cross-party group of parliamentarians who had been persuaded, through contact with survivors and through the work of the Child Migrants Trust, that formal acknowledgement was both appropriate and overdue. The resistance came from civil servants who were concerned about the legal and financial implications of an apology, from some who felt that the organizations primarily responsible were private charities and churches rather than the government directly, and from the general institutional reluctance to create precedents for acknowledging historical wrongs. The counter-argument that prevailed was that the British government had been an active participant in the schemes, not just a passive backdrop. The British government had funded them through the Empire Settlement Act and through grants to individual organisations. British government inspectors had, at various points, investigated the programmes, and their reports had been received and in some cases acted upon. The British government had maintained the official records that survivors needed to trace their histories. The government was not an innocent bystander. It was a party to what had happened. Gordon Brown's 2010 apology acknowledged this. It acknowledged that the government bore responsibility and that the children had deserved better from their country. Whether it fully captured the depth of what had been done is a question that different survivors answer differently. Some felt it was adequate, some felt it was long overdue and still insufficient. Some felt that without financial redress on a larger scale, any apology was incomplete. The travel assistance program that Brown announced was valuable but limited, and the organization's compensation schemes, while important for those who could access them, did not reach everyone who had been harmed. The archives question is one that deserves continued attention. The records held by British and Australian government departments, by charitable organisations, by churches and religious orders are the key to family tracing for many survivors and their descendants. The policy of record opening that began in the 1990s has made significant progress, but has not been uniform across all record holders. Some organizations have been more cooperative than others. Some records have been lost, in some cases genuinely through the ordinary destruction of old administrative records. In other cases, under circumstances that raise questions about whether the destruction was as accidental as claimed. The technology of genetic genealogy has opened new possibilities that did not exist at the time of the formal inquiries. DNA testing services that allow people to identify relatives they have never met have been used by descendants of child migrants to trace family connections across generations and continents. There are documented cases of descendants who discovered their child migrant ancestry through DNA matches with distant relatives, who then traced the story back to a great-grandparent who had been shipped from Britain at 8 years old and had never spoken of it. These discoveries are continuing. The database of genetic genealogy is growing. The connections that are being made are, in a very small way, repairing connections that were broken by institutional decisions made a century ago. The story of what happened to the children who grew up in the Australian institutions and the Canadian placements, and who then became parents themselves, is a story that has not been fully told. The intergenerational effects of the migration experience are visible in family patterns and community health statistics, but have not been studied as systematically as the experience of the first-generation survivors. There is research beginning in this area, research that looks at the parenting styles and family formations of former child migrants and their descendants, that tries to trace the specific ways in which the experience of childhood deprivation and identity erasure transmits into the next generation. What is already clear from the first-generation testimony is that many former child migrants experience significant difficulty in their own parenting. People who had never experienced secure, nurturing parental care had no model for providing it. People who had been told they were unwanted by their own parents and who had internalized that story sometimes found it difficult to fully believe in their own children's attachment to them. People whose childhoods had been characterized by institutional control rather than family warmth sometimes defaulted to the only models of care they had, which were institutional rather than familial. This is not a criticism of former child migrants as parents. It is a description of the predictable consequences of what was done to them. The damage to their capacity for certain kinds of relationship was not their fault. It was the result of specific policies carried out by specific institutions with the support of specific governments. And the transmission of that damage to their children, and in some cases their grandchildren, is not a natural occurrence. It is a further consequence of the original wrong, radiating outward across generations. The formal history of the child migration schemes is contained in the reports of inquiries, in the archives of organizations, in the decisions of courts, in the speeches of politicians. The real history is in the individual lives, in the stories that survivors tell, and that their children and grandchildren are beginning to piece together. It is in the gap between the official narrative, these children were rescued and given opportunities, and the lived reality of 150,000 people who were told the wrong story about themselves and then required to make a life from it. We are, at this point in history, the inheritors of that gap. We know now what was done. We have the reports and the apologies and the testimony. The question that this knowledge creates is not primarily about the past. It is about what we do with the knowledge, how we hold it. Whether we allow the official acknowledgements to close the story, or whether we insist on keeping it open, keeping it present, keeping it connected to the living people who still carry it and the structural questions it raises about how institutions treat the vulnerable. The children in that photograph on the dock, the ones we began with, grew up. They became old. Many of them are gone now, but some of them are still here. And all of them, those who are gone, and those who remain deserve to have their story told without evasion and without the comfortable simplifications that allow us to regard it as something that belongs entirely to the past. It does not belong entirely to the past. It belongs to the present, to the question of what kind of society we are, and to the responsibility that question places on all of us who share it. The specific mechanics of how children were actually recruited for migration programs are worth examining in some detail, because the recruitment process was where many of the most significant deceptions occurred and where the gap between official representation and actual practice was widest. Charitable organisations in Britain had networks of contacts that reached into hospitals, workhouses, police courts, schools, and parish offices. When a child came to the attention of any of these institutions, the charitable organisation might be notified. When a family was under economic stress, when a parent was ill or imprisoned or otherwise incapacitated, the organisation might approach them with an offer of care. The offer was almost never explicitly described as potential permanent emigration. It was described as temporary help, a safe place for the child while the family situation resolved. Good food, clean air, proper care, education. The families who accepted these offers were not naive. They were desperate. When a mother of 5 children is ill, when there is no money for food, when the winter is coming and there is no coal, the offer of care for 1 or 2 of the children is not something she can easily refuse. The conditions under which consent was obtained were in many cases conditions of desperation that made genuinely free consent impossible. The law did not, for most of the history of the schemes, require more than a signature. The fact that the signature was obtained from a person who was not in a position to fully understand what she was signing, who was not in a state of mind to adequately evaluate the long-term consequences of what she was agreeing to, was not the organization's legal problem. There are cases in the historical record where children were taken from parents who had specifically refused to consent to emigration. There are cases where consent forms were signed by relatives or neighbors who had no legal authority to give consent. There are cases where children were registered as orphans when they were not orphans, where parents were described as dead or untraceable when they were neither. The systematic nature of these irregularities, the fact that they appear across multiple organizations and multiple decades, suggests that they were not the product of individual negligence, but of institutional cultures that regarded the technical requirements of consent as obstacles to be managed rather than rights to be respected. The children themselves had no voice in any of this. A 7-year-old child does not have the legal or practical capacity to object to decisions made by adults with authority over them. When a child was told they were going on a trip, they went on the trip. When a child was told their parents had died, they had no means of independently verifying whether this was true. When a child was placed on a ship to Australia, they sailed to Australia. The powerlessness of the children in the face of institutional authority was absolute, and the organizations that ran the schemes counted on it. The ships themselves were part of the experience in ways that have not always been fully examined. The voyages to Australia took between 4 and 6 weeks, depending on the route. The voyages to Canada took between 1 and 3 weeks. The children travelled in groups, in steerage or in second class, depending on the organization's budget. They were supervised by adults from the sending organizations or by crew members. They ate institutional food. They slept in dormitories or shared cabins. They had very little to do. Former migrants who have described the voyages speak of boredom, of seasickness, of the strange unreality of being at sea for weeks with no land visible, of the excitement of seeing dolphins or flying fish, of the way the temperature changed as the ship moved through different latitudes. They speak of the gradual disappearance of Britain behind the horizon and the gradual approach of an unknown coast ahead. For the younger children, children who were 4 or 5 or 6 years old, The voyage was the entirety of their conscious awareness. They had no clear memory of what had preceded it. They would arrive at their destination as if they had always been heading there. For the older children, the voyage was a period of suspension between known and unknown, a space in which the enormity of what was happening might begin to be felt. Former migrants who were 10 or 12 when they sailed described the experience of standing on the deck at night, watching the stars, aware that the stars were different here than they were in England, and that this difference was somehow fundamental to what was happening to them. They described conversations with other children about where they were going and what it would be like, conversations that were mostly speculation, since no one really knew. They described the gradual formation of friendships among the group, the alliances and antagonisms of children stuck together in a confined space for weeks. The moment of arrival has been described by dozens of survivors. The appearance of the Australian coast or the Canadian docks, coming out of the ocean, the smell of a different country, the heat for those arriving in Australia, the cold sometimes for those arriving in Canada, the noise and activity of a working port, and then the process of disembarkation, of being organized and marshaled by adults, of being collected by representatives of the receiving institution, of being put in vehicles and driven away from the port toward a destination that most of them had never seen and that few of them could have located on a map. For children going to the large institutions in Western Australia, the drive from the port of Fremantle into the country north or south of Perth was often their first experience of Australian landscape. Former residents of Bindoon described the drive north into the hills, the red earth, the scrub, the sense of enormous space, the distance between one property and the next. For children who had grown up in the terraced streets of London or Liverpool or Glasgow, the scale of the Australian landscape was bewildering. Not frightening exactly, but fundamentally alien in a way that reinforced the sense of having arrived somewhere that was not home and might never be home. The reception at the institutions was, by multiple accounts, businesslike. Children were registered, assigned to dormitories or cottages, given their institutional clothing, told the rules. Former residents described the particular institutional smell, disinfectant, floor polish, institutional cooking that they would associate with the place for the rest of their lives. They described the noise of a large number of children in a confined institutional space. They described the face of the first brother or sister they encountered and whether that face seemed kind or not. The first days in the institution were a period of acute disorientation. Everything was unfamiliar. The food was different. The climate was different. The accents of the other children were different. The rules were different. Former residents described the process of working out the social landscape of the institution, which older children were to be respected and which were to be avoided, which brothers were less dangerous, and which more, where the informal spaces of relative freedom were within the institutional regime. The education that children received in the Australian institutions was, as noted earlier, generally inadequate. But the specific character of that inadequacy varied. In some institutions, the schooling was minimal by design, because the institutions needed the children's labour, and schooling competed with labour for the children's time. In others, the schooling was inadequate by default, because the teaching staff were not qualified, because the resources were insufficient, because the priority was religious formation rather than academic development. The religious formation was intensive and for many children, a central feature of their institutional experience. In the Catholic institutions, Mass was daily. Religious instruction occupied a significant portion of the school day. The brothers and sisters who ran the institutions were themselves deeply committed to the religious life and regarded the formation of their charges in the faith as one of their primary responsibilities. For some children, this formation was the most positive element of their institutional experience, a source of meaning and community in an otherwise difficult environment. For others, it was experienced as coercive, as the imposition of a faith they had not chosen in a context where refusal was not an option. The complex legacy of the religious formation for former child migrants is something that survivors describe in widely varying terms. Some are observant Catholics today and attribute their faith partly to their institutional upbringing. Some have no relationship with religion. Some have an active hostility to Catholicism that is directly connected to their experience of the institutions. Some describe a complicated ambivalence, an appreciation for elements of the religious tradition, combined with anger at the way it was used to control and sometimes to harm them. The question of reparation, as distinct from apology, has been contested throughout the public engagement with this history. The Australian Senate inquiry recommended financial assistance for survivors, primarily for travel and family tracing. Some organisations established compensation funds. Some individuals have been awarded damages through litigation. But the scale of the financial response has not matched the scale of the harm, and many survivors have received little or nothing in material terms. The argument for more substantial financial reparation is straightforward. The organisations that ran the migration schemes benefited financially from the children's presence in their institutions. They received government grants. They received private donations on the basis of their work with the children. They received the economic benefit of the children's labour. The children, in most cases, received nothing. They left the institutions with no savings, minimal education, and no family support. The economic disadvantage they experienced as adults was a direct consequence of what had been done to them, and addressing that disadvantage materially, not just symbolically, is a reasonable component of an adequate response. The counter-argument from the organisations is that many of them are charitable entities without the resources to fund comprehensive reparation, that the most culpable parties in the government sense are better placed to provide financial redress, and that the priority should be the services, record access, and family tracing support that survivors most directly need. This argument has some merit, but it has also functioned, in some cases, to limit the financial accountability of organisations that do have resources and that have benefited historically from the programs for which they are apologising. The record access issue has improved significantly since the 1990s, but is not fully resolved. There are still survivors and descendants who encounter difficulties accessing records held by organisations or government departments. There are still cases where records that should exist cannot be found, where the explanation given for their absence is less than fully convincing, where the suspicion that records were destroyed to prevent accountability cannot be entirely dismissed. The ongoing work of archivists, researchers, and advocate organisations to locate, preserve, and make accessible the records of the child migration schemes is essential work that deserves support. The last formal child migration, the last child sent from Britain to Australia under an official scheme, arrived in 1970. For the 12 years that had preceded it, the programme had been declining as the ideological and demographic conditions that sustained it changed. The final years of the Australian programme were characterised by organisational inertia more than active belief, by institutions that had been doing this for decades and had not yet found a reason to stop, that were still accepting children and still receiving government subsidy, while the broader social and political context that had created the programme was quietly dissolving around them. The children who arrived in those final years, in the mid and late 1960s, were in some respects the most anomalous of all, because they arrived in an Australia that was beginning to change, that was questioning the White Australia policy, that was beginning a cultural conversation about Aboriginal rights, that was being exposed, through television and popular culture, to the social revolutions happening in Britain and America. These children arrived in institutions that were operating on the basis of assumptions that were already, by that point, being challenged in the broader society. Some of them became, as adults, among the most articulate advocates for acknowledgement of the migration program's harms. Their relative youth compared to the earlier generations of migrants meant that they were still alive and able to participate in the public inquiries and advocacy campaigns of the 1990s and 2000s. Their testimony was, in many cases, particularly powerful because they could connect the personal experience to the historical context in ways that they had had time and education to develop. The youngest survivors of the Australian program are now in their late 50s and early 60s. The oldest are in their 80s and 90s. This is the last decade in which the program can be understood through direct testimony, through the voices of people who were there. The window is closing. The urgency of documenting, preserving, and understanding this history before it passes entirely out of living memory is real. What remains after the survivors are gone is the archive, the research, the advocacy organizations, and the family stories that are being transmitted to children and grandchildren. What remains is the capacity of subsequent generations to hold the truth of what happened, to refuse the consoling simplifications, to keep faith with the 150,000 children who were told the wrong story about themselves. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the only kind of reparation that time permits. The reparation of accurate memory. The photograph on the dock. The children in their best clothes. The ship behind them. We know their story now. We know what the ship was and where it was going and what would happen to the children who boarded it. We know that most of them had parents. We know that the bright future they were being promised was, in most cases, a story told to make the transfer easier. For the adults, not for the children. We know what the institutions were and what some of them did. We know about the lies told about dead parents and abandoned children. We know about the decades of searching and the reunions that came too late. We know about the parliamentary inquiries and the apologies and the compensation that was not enough. And knowing this, we are obligated to something, not to guilt, which is not useful here, and which the survivors have generally said they do not want from us, but to acknowledgement, to accurate understanding, to the refusal to let this history be simplified into either sentimentality or indifference. The children in the photograph were real. Their parents, searching for them in Britain, were real. The damage done to them was real and lasting and multi-generational, and the forces that made it possible, the class contempt, the imperial logic, the philanthropic self-confidence, the institutional unaccountability, are not artifacts of history. They are tendencies that persist in new forms and that require new forms of vigilance to check. That is the full obligation of this history, not just to know what happened, but to understand why it was possible, and to hold that understanding as a permanent part of the way we think about power, institutions, and the children who are placed in their care. The photograph on the dock is more than a historical artifact. It is a question addressed to everyone who looks at it. What do you owe to the people in it? What does a society owe to the children it places in institutional care? What does a government owe to the citizens whose children it allowed to be transported to the other side of the world under false pretenses? These are not questions with clean answers. They are questions that require sitting with discomfort, that require refusing the escape routes of distancing and rationalization. They are the kind of questions that only become generative if you hold them honestly, without looking away. The survivors held them for decades before anyone else was willing to. They held them in silence, in many cases, because the official story was so different from their own experience that speaking felt impossible, felt like an accusation that would not be believed. They held them until the investigative journalists came, until the parliamentary inquiries gave them a forum, until the formal acknowledgements told them, finally, that what they remembered was real, that what had been done to them was wrong, that they had not been mistaken about the nature of their own experience. That vindication, even when it came late, even when it came after the deaths of parents and siblings who would have been glad to hear it, mattered. It matters. The truth, told accurately, about what was done to 150,000 children by the most powerful civilization on Earth, matters, not because it changes what happened, but because it changes the story, because it replaces the official narrative with the true one, because it gives the children in the photograph their real history back, even if only in the telling. There is one more thing worth saying, and it is simple enough that it almost does not need saying, except that the history we have just moved through suggests it very much does. Children are not instruments of policy. They are not demographic resources. They are not the raw material of empire or the charitable projects of institutions that believe they know better than families what families need. They are people, complete, specific, irreplaceable people who deserve the fundamental protections of knowing who they are, where they come from, and that the adults with authority over their lives are accountable to standards they did not set themselves. The child migration schemes failed every one of these tests, and the test of whether we have truly understood that failure is not whether we can articulate it in hindsight. It is whether the understanding changes anything going forward. That test is still being taken. The results are not yet in, but the children in the photograph are watching, and so, in their way, are all the children who come after them. That is what this story is, and that is why it needs to keep being told.